All things were created in heaven and on things on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities or things. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things. And in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn again from the dead, that in everything he might be the eminent. Verse 19, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. I suspect the question here is, somebody might have been challenged by the Jehovah's Witnesses using this verse. If we are saying Jesus is God, yet here we are told he is the firstborn of creation. Now the way the Jehovah's Witnesses interpret that verse is to say that Jesus was the first creature of God. Right? That's how they interpret it. And if therefore he was the first creature of God, then there is no way he can be equal with God. Now that interpretation is very faulty, even if you look at the context and you say, which is why I've read up to verse 19. So now let's go to verse 18. Verse 18 says he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the what? So the word firstborn is used how many times there? At least twice. Eh? Yes. So the question is, what does this word firstborn mean? So in verse 15 we are told he is the firstborn of creation. In verse 17 we are told he is the firstborn from the dead. And let's compare those two verses, 15 and 17. Was Jesus the first human being to ever rise from the dead? Was it? Was it? Was it?
Yes.
Was it?
Yes.
What about Jairus' daughter? Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead before Jesus even died. What about Lazarus? What about the son of that widow? In Luke, is it Luke 7? Or Luke 11? Luke 7, 11, 7. What about the widow, the Shunammite woman? Can I just answer this question and then we just move on, because we are running out of time now. We only have today. So I want to finish this and then we go back to a substantive question. All I'm trying to show you is, if for you the word firstborn from the dead means Jesus was the first person to be raised from the dead, then you have misunderstood the meaning of the word firstborn. Makes sense? Eh? So, in verse 17, what does the word firstborn therefore mean? It cannot mean that Jesus is the first person to be raised from there, because obviously there have been others in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. What that word firstborn from the dead means is just this: that of all those who have died and risen from the dead, his resurrection is unique and different and superior. That's what it means. Okay? It is different, it is unique, and it is superior. In this sense, let me tell you then, of all the people who rose from the dead in the Old Testament and the New Testament, all of them died again, right? You notice that? Only Jesus died, rose, never to die again. He's the first one to rise like that. Nobody else has ever done that. Makes sense? Eh? So the word firstborn here, in the context, does not mean the first in being. It simply means uniqueness. It connotes a difference. It has the idea of superiority. one who is way above. That is why still in verse 17, other words are used together with the word firstborn. We are told in verse 17, he is before all things. In other words, he has priority over all things. Again, we are told in verse 18, he is the beginning. We are told in verse 18, in all things, he has what? Preeminence. Ananafasia, juu kabisa. Now, that is what the word firstborn means in verse 17. Okay? Now, if that's what that word means, contextually, that word cannot mean anything different in verse 15. It means the same. Now, let me answer very quickly like this. Firstborn of all creation simply means this, that Jesus is above all creation, that Jesus is different and unique, and that Jesus is supreme over all creation. It doesn't mean that he's a creature, in the sense that all of us are creatures. It is talking about the high position that Christ occupies relative to creation. Creation is here, he is there. He has preeminence, he has priority, he sits way above. That is the only way you can look at that word firstborn in a consistent way, so that it makes sense in verse 15 and verse 17. Does that help you? Does that help you? Does it? Yeah. Now, other things can help you there in that passage. For example, if you look at verse 20, rather verse 19, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, isn't it? He has the fullness of God. In other words, everything that is true about God is true about Christ. That's what it means by the fullness of God. What is true about God is true about Christ. One of the things that is true about God is that God is uncreated. Christ therefore must be uncreated. That is why the Bible, when it speaks about Christ, even as the Son of God, it doesn't talk about him as the Son of God by birth, physical birth. It uses a very technical word, referring us to the eternal begottenness of the Son from the Father. Just like the Spirit is eternally proceeding from the Father. But none of them has a beginning and none of them has an end. You can't say the Spirit was created at some point. No. Okay? So that's how I would answer that. Does that help, you think? Yeah. Yeah. So it is firstborn in terms of preeminence. Not firstborn in terms of they are created, he was also created. No. It connotes his supremacy over it, his priority over it. All right. Now then, we go back to what we were doing. So, the gospel there is first and foremost about Christ. Secondly, we say that the gospel is about the work that Christ has done. The work that Christ has done. In 1 Corinthians 15, that work is spoken of expressly as him dying. Him dying. It is expressed also by implication. Look at the remainder of chapter 15. It includes his resurrection, which again by implication has a reference to the life he lives. So when we are considering then the work that Christ, that we have seen, the God-man, has done, that work essentially, we look at it as involving those three things. That Christ lived a perfectly righteous life. And then Christ died a painful, sacrificial, substitutionary death, in that he rose again from the dead. That is how we look at the totality of the work of Christ. Now, we can say more about the work of Christ. We can talk about his ascension to heaven. We can talk about his sitting at the right hand of the Father, where he's making intercession for us. But at the most basic level, we are looking at his life, his death, and his resurrection. So we must know Jesus. But we must also know what he has done. So number one, what has Jesus done? He's finished work. What has Jesus done? Now, very briefly, like I've said, the work of Christ is captured in those two things. One, how he lived. He has lived a perfect life. Now, do we have passages in the Bible which tell us that Jesus Christ lived a perfect life? Do we? Are there passages like that? Yes. Which tells us that Jesus was in fact perfect? Tell me some of those. For example, which passage do you have in mind which tell us that Jesus Christ in fact lived a perfect life? That he obeyed the law of God perfectly? One passage that you might have in mind. Yes? Philippians? Yes?
Philippians 2.
2.
He became obedient up to the point of death.
He absolutely did. He became obedient. So the work of Christ there is described as a work of obedience. And by the way, what Ezra just told us is an extremely important concept, because when we come to dealing with the atonement of Christ, okay, as we come to look at our Christology, we will look at the atonement of Christ. One of the things that I will tell you is that one of the widest categories under which the entire work of Christ can be conceived is that it was a work of obedience. Ilikuwa ni kazi ya utii. Okay, so let's go there. Philippians 2. Here's what it says. Verse 8. Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming what? Obedient to the point of death, even the death on the cross. So now, what Paul is telling us here is that the entire life of Jesus Christ was a life of obedience. From the day he was born to the day he dies, everything in between, it was a work of obedience. Okay? Let us flesh out that obedience in very tangible terms. We have already seen, for example, in Galatians chapter 4, that he was born under the law. Alizaliwa chini ya sheria. Why was he born under the law? So that he might obey that law. So that he might obey that law. Jesus himself came in Matthew 5, and he tells us in verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. To the contrary, I have come to fulfill it. I have come to fulfill it. Now, you can read, and a little bit earlier we were looking at this passage, somebody here during the break, at Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, which tells us that we do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. In other words, we have a high priest who can sympathize with us. And we are told that he can sympathize with us because he was tempted. Jesus was tempted. Alijaribiwa kwa kila njia, in every way, just like we are, yet without sin. He became obedient unto death. Now, twice at least, during his life, first time during his baptism, the second time up on the mountain of transfiguration, God himself bears witness from heaven about him and tells us, this is my beloved son. With him, I am not just pleased, I am well pleased. He has the direct endorsement of the Father as to what his life looked like. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 25, which we read earlier, we are told expressly about Christ as our high priest. We are told he was innocent, isn't it? He was holy and innocent, completely separated from sinners, we are told. In 2 Corinthians, chapter 5 and verse 21, we are told about him that him who knew no sin. He knew no sin. Okay? So Jesus is born flesh and blood like us, born under the law. He is tempted and tried in every way under that law. And then Jesus becomes the first human being who lived an entirely righteous life from the cradle to the grave. From the cradle. Yeah, very good. From there up to the grave, never touched by sin. The spotless, perfect Lamb of God, isn't it? Yep.
Yes, I have a question.
You have a question? Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you stand?
You can stand, you can sit, whichever is easier.
About the sinlessness.
Yes.
of Jesus.
Yes.
That he lived
Perfectly righteous.
perfect. The question is, did he live perfect because by nature he was unable to sin? Or he was very much able to sin, but chose not to as a way of obedience to God? Will you please help us? If it was by nature that even if he had loved to do that, there's no way he could have done it. Or he had that ability, but he chose not to.
Now the question that Cosmos is asking is a question that is very hotly debated, by the way, even by very many good people. And it is a question of what we call the doctrine of the impeccability of Christ. Right? And the question is this. We all agree that Christ never sinned, right? It's very clear. The question then becomes, was it ever possible for him to sin? Or was it impossible for him to sin? Now, if you answer the question in the second way, that it was impossible for him to sin, the other question is also raised. Were his temptations real? Or were they just a show? You know? So that's where that becomes a difficult question. Okay? Now let me say this. I think there are good people on either side who for good reasons believe both ways. There is one view that is called, in theological parlance, the posse, the care view, and then there's what we call the non-posse. Yeah. Those are simply technical terms to describe what you just said. Posse, possible pecare, sin. Non-posse, non-possible pecare, sin. These are the wide categories that we deal with here. Now, those who say that Jesus was not able to sin argue from this standpoint. And they argue from, among other things, that Jesus is fully God, right? And therefore fully man. Not therefore. He is fully God and fully man. But he is not two people. He is one person. He is one person. Now, if we go further and ask the question, where does Christ get his personality? Where does he get his personality? I believe we have to say that he gets his personality from his divinity, isn't it? Because the person of Christ existed even before his humanity existed. Now the argument is made then that for that reason, Christ being a divine person, that alone made it impossible for him to sin. Okay? So that argument can be made there. That argument can be made from the standpoint that, and this is a dicey one, for other reasons which I can't discuss now because of time, that by virtue of the fact that from before the foundations of the world, Christ had been ordained to be the perfect Lamb of God. That's, is it First Peter 1, verse 18, 19, 20? Okay? So it was ordained in the decrees of God as such, and there was no way that the decrees of God were going to be announced. So in that sense, again, it was impossible for him to sin. Okay? So that is the one argument. The other argument is, like I've said, those who say, no, if that's the case, then the temptations were perfunctory. They were very, very perfunctory. And really, they were nothing. It was just a pretense, a show. That's one argument that is made, which is easier actually to respond to. The much more difficult one to respond to is the one that would say that if we say that it was impossible for Christ to sin, then we are in a sense denying his humanity. All right? Somebody would argue like that. So then, now the second argument is a little bit more difficult to answer. The only way in which I can respond to it is by saying that at some level may, I'm not sure that's what they are driving at, but it may be presupposing that probably sin is an essential part of human nature, which is not true. Because when Adam was first created, he was created without sin. Okay? So if that's what they mean, then that's how we'll answer it. Now, the second thing that he would say is to say then that if it was impossible for him to sin, then that would have meant that his temptations were perfunctory. I think it has been argued, I think quite ably, that the fact that Christ could not sin made his temptations even worse than ours. Okay? Here's the reason. And the reason is this. Let's say you have a rubber band, mpira, rubber. Umeshika pale, umeshika tunavuta. You know, you feel the tension. There's a tension that is building. That tension will build and build and build until a breaking point. When it reaches breaking point, the rubber band katika. Once the rubber band breaks, the tension is released. It's no longer there. Right? Another example. You are hungry or you are thirsty. The tension and the pain of the hunger and the thirst increases in intensity, but the moment you eat or you drink, the tension disappears, isn't it? Makes sense? Let us think of it this way. If you are feeling pain today, the pain continues and grows and persists and there is tension. But once you get drugs and the pain imekatika, the tension is gone. Now, the thing is, imagine a situation whereby you are in a state whereby you are feeling the tension, and there is no possibility of that tension breaking. Is it better or is it worse? You see? Because one of the ways in which we release the tension of temptation is by succumbing to it. Once you have succumbed to it, the tension is gone. What if you can't even succumb to it? Is the tension worse? Or is it? It's more. And so that's what I'm saying. The fact that Christ was not able to sin made the feeling of his temptation maybe more intense, even worse. So it is not true to say that because he couldn't sin, then the temptations were perfunctory. Okay? That's what I'm willing to say at that point, if it helps. Okay? Now we look at those micro details when we come to Christology. The implicability of Christ and all that, and we can give more arguments about this and that. I can expound my position better, but those are the two views. If you all know where I stand as of now, I stand here with an unposted card, as you can guess from what I've said. Okay? Yeah.
Nimeuliza siku sababu nilikuwa na kitu chochote.
Yeah.
Nimeuliza kwa sababu nimekuja.
Ndio.
Na nilikuwa na niulize.
Yes.
So
and that's okay. Thank you. Okay? But you see, that's what we do. So can we move on from that a bit? Now, I'm beginning to get afraid that we might not finish in time. But let's try. So Christ lived a perfectly sinless life. That's what the Bible teaches us. His entire life, he obeyed God perfectly by keeping God's law. Tempted in every way, just like we are, yet without sin. Now, there's something else he did. We are told, secondly, that the Christ who lived a perfect life also died, isn't it? He also died. He also died. He also died. What is death? Can we try to define death according to the language and the concepts of the Bible? In one word, if you are to define what death is, how do you define it? That's one word you can use to define death. Cursed. Jesus Christ was cursed. Did I say that? Did I? What he took on that cross, let me use more appropriate words. What he took on that cross was, he took upon himself the curse. He endured the curse. Another word you can use to describe the death of Jesus is punished. He was punished. He was punished. Now, let's go to 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3. Let me show you how that works. Let us not lose the train of thought. I'm trying to now unpack the details of what the gospel is. I've given the general basic overview of it. Christ, his work, the reason for his work. We explained Christ, now we're explaining his work. 1 Peter 3 and verse 18. Now, in the interest of time, I'll read it. It says, for Christ also suffered once. You see again the word once comes up. Huh? He suffered once. Why did he suffer? Why did he suffer? He suffered for sin. Now we will come to see the man of sin afterwards in more detail. But when someone suffers as a result of sin, what is that? Because what is sin? How does the Bible define sin? There are 3 or 4 ways in which the Bible defines sin. 1 John 3, 4. Is it 3, 4? Yeah. Sin is the transgression of the word. Yeah. Kuasi sheria. You've been told do this, you've not done it. You've been told don't do this, you've done it. Sin is basically breaking the law. Okay? Also, sin is defined in the Bible as that good which you know you are supposed to do and you fail to do it. For you it is